So let's get into the content for this week. What is LGBT? What is LGBTQ? LGBTQIA plus? Why does this acronym continue to expand over the years? So I want you to take some time to remember or think about what these letters mean within this acronym. Take some time to think about that. Okay. So L, that stands for lesbian. G, that stands for gay. B, that stands for bisexual. T, that stands for trans, transgender. Modern discourses try to stay away from transsexual, the term transsexual, because transgender and transsexual were often used as a delineation to communicate whether someone had their gender affirmation surgeries, whether top and or bottom or not. Okay. So whereas transgender communicated the idea, okay, you have a transgender identity, gender identity. However, you did not have the hormonal and or surgical affirmation surgeries or indoor procedures yet. If you did as a trans individual, that will make you a transsexual. However, there are many trans individuals and collectives who argue, you know what, it's not society's business as to whether or not I had my top and or bottom surgery. It doesn't matter. So I'm gonna just stick with trans or transgender, transsexual. That's no one's business. That's putting the public into my private realm, my corporal private realm. Okay. So that's another reason why, in addition to being this clinicalized, historically clinicalized term, why trans and transgender are now widely used in modern discourses in comparison to transsexual. Now, when it comes to Q, that stands for queer or questioning. When it comes to I, that stands for intersex. When it comes to A, that stands for asexual, agender, and ally. An ally is typically a cisgender and or heterosexual person who is part of the community simply because they support the goals and initiatives and objectives of the LGBTQ plus community. So you do not have, with being an ally, you do not necessarily have to be anything other than, identify anything other than cisgender or sexually queer, okay? To cisgender or heterosexual, excuse me. But you can simply be a part of the community because you support the community. Now, plus, that stands for all the other identities. That doesn't make them less or more important, but many people like humans tend to like simplicity. So that's why all these other terms aren't added. But the plus can stand for demisexual, which is sexual attractions, feelings. Pansexual, you're just attracted to all genders. Okay. And you have BDSM that's incorporated within the LGBTQ plus community. You have heteroflexible, homoflexible. Let's see here. Homoflexible, heteroflexible, homoromantic, heteroromantic, all of these different gender and sexually queer identities. So let's move forward. Why the need for an acronym? Why the need for a community? What's the point of having a name for a community? What's the point of having a community? So having an acronym highlights the diversity of identities that have been historically marginalized and systematically targeted, okay? And the need for a community is important because it demonstrates the collaborative efforts to diversify macro institutions, promote visibility, and advocate for the safety and inclusion of the LGBTQ plus community. So these are the reasons why we have an acronym and also the need for community. So what are the implications of gender and sexual stigmatization? Where does it come from, gender and sexual stigmatization? And what's the praxis? What is the need for social change? How can we induce social change to get rid of the stigmatization? So I want to show you two figures that no one needs to forget about because their stories represent the travesties of what can happen if gender and sexual stigmatization exists, continues to exist. So we have here on the left, Sakia Gunn. She was a 15-year-old masculine presenting Black lesbian who lived in New Jersey. And she was coming home from a party with her friends where this man approached them on the street and flirted with them, asked for their number, etc. But the Sakia and her friends, they were lesbians, and they said, no, we're not interested, and kept about their business. So the man got upset, followed them, and stabbed Sakia in the chest, and she passed away. Whereas on the right, we have Matthew Shepard, who was a 21-year-old man, gay man who went to a bar in Wyoming, minded his business, and a group of white men were watching him inside the bar, and they must have noticed something about Matthew that communicated his queer sexuality. And that's typically, queer sexuality is often communicated through some form of gender deviancy, whether in tone. We talked about this last week when it comes to gender comportment, how you move and behave your body, right? So they must have noticed some gender deviancy from the hegemonic masculine norm that deviated from the hegemonic masculine norm in terms of tone, body movement, the way he was sitting, etc. Now, this is not to blame Matthew for what happened to him. That's not to blame him at all. What I'm saying is the men probably noticed some form of gender deviancy that sparked the thought, maybe this guy is gay. So let me tell you what happened. Matthew leaves the bar. The white men follow Matthew out of the bar. They beat him up. They physically assault him. They tie him to the back of their pickup truck and they drive across the rough terrain of the Wyoming countryside until his body was tattered and limbs were starting to dislocate from his body. So, unfortunately, he died along with Sakia in her story. So these two cases represent the travesties and the depths of hatred that can happen when you have these patrollees of these already fragile boundaries of cis heteronormativity continuing. These are the extents and lengths that people will go in order to enforce these precarious boundaries around cis heteronormativity, cis heteropatriarchy. Okay? With Sakia's case, you have a man who was so fragile in his masculinity for being turned down from his romantic and sexual advances that he retaliated by killing this woman. And when it comes to Matthew, you have men, again, who are so fragile in their sense of masculinity and sexuality that they prove their sense of masculinity and sexuality by assaulting and killing a queer man. So this historical stigmatization, the implications of that is bullying, social ostracism, legal implications, and ultimately death. Okay. So the praxis, meaning the social change, is to include the following, which we'll get to, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So I want you to think about the applicable roots here with these two stories, the applicable branches and applicable leaves, okay? And our praxis for eliminating these issues. So we cannot have these travesties. So we cannot have these societal exclusions. So when it comes to applicable roots, branches, and leaves, when it comes to the privilege, oppression, and discrimination map, you have cis heteronormativity in combination with patriarchy, which equals out to cis heteropatriarchy. That's the root of both issues here, of both Sakia and Matthew's stories. With the branches, you have homophobia, sexism, and heterosexism. Now, we know homophobia is this technically the extreme fear of queer individuals, okay? People often define homophobia as an extreme hatred. And sexism, which is the marginalization, systematic marginalization of women, okay, in favor of men. And then you have heterosexism, which is this gender-specific type of sexism, okay? So make sure to keep that in mind where you have, with heterosexism, examples would be a masculine presenting woman, a masculine presenting lesbian woman, okay? So she will face more plight in comparison to a feminine presenting lesbian woman. Why is that? And another example, you have a feminine presenting man, a feminine presenting gay man who will face more plight in comparison to a masculine presenting gay man. Now, all four individuals in these examples, across these two examples, are gay, but their gender presentation is different. So when it comes to gender deviant, cisgender gay folks, why is there a difference there in severity of plight? It's because these gay individuals are not only deviating from gender norms, particularly when it comes to feminine presenting gay men and masculine presenting lesbian women. Not only are they deviating from gender norms, but they're also deviating from heterosexual norms as well. So you have a double whammy there. It's often been a tactic to hide one's sexuality by maintaining some sort of hegemonic gender conformity to this cis heteronormative standard, okay? So everything that you associated with hegemonically masculine men, talking with a deep voice, having a wide gait, having a muscular body, etc. However, if this man follows all these rules of what it means to be a hegemonically masculine man, but he's gay, you can kind of hide your sexuality under the cloak of gender conformity, hegemonic gender conformity. Likewise, with a similar example with a woman. If a woman is hegemonically feminine, wearing a makeup, wearing the lashes, having the long hair, etc., the feminine form-fitting clothing, she can hide her sexuality under the cloak of that gender conformity. However, when you combine gender deviancy with queer sexuality, oh, that upsets the cis heteropatriarchy. It upsets it. And then you have consequences, such as what we talked about before: bullying, death, societal ostracism, legal implications, etc. And we examined some legal implications in your reading for this week when it comes from family formation, when it comes to LGBTQ plus individuals, not being able to adopt, not being less likely to access IVF, ART services, okay? So when it comes to the leaves of privilege and oppression, with these two examples with Zakiya Gunn and Matthew Shepard, the leaves is the fragility of this hegemonic masculinity and heterosexuality, okay? So when it comes to the praxis of combating this, okay, Dr. Maldonado, we know about these problems now. How do we fix it? Good question. So more education when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community, when it comes to gender and sexual stigmatization, when it comes to institutional equity and equality for all. The more people are educated about something, the more access to knowledge someone has, the less likely they are to have these uninformed biases, prejudices, acts of discrimination that all funnel into the roots, which is privileging some groups, i.e. cisgender, heterosexual men, etc., white folks, at the expense of others when it comes to systemically oppressed groups. Black folks, folks of color, sexually queer folks, LGBTQ plus, okay, trans individuals, working class and poor individuals, okay? So when it comes to praxis, again, implementing that social change, doing things to remedy issues, systemic issues in society. All of you have the power to do that. Oh, Dr. Maldonado, I'm just a student. or I'm just a cafeteria worker, or I'm just a bus driver. I can't do anything foundational. Yes, you can. You have the power to do anything. You are a living, functioning, breathing work of art, work of magic. You have the power to correct issues, and it simply comes from having that knowledge. And once you have that knowledge, you can then devise strategic strategies of how to remedy these societal problems. So you apply theory, i.e., knowledge, to practice, i.e., actions, in order to implement this social change called praxis. That's what praxis is, the application of knowledge to actions. Okay? You have to know what to do in order to do something solution oriented. Okay? Now, when it comes to interactive human relationships, having that tangible exposure to folks within the LGBTQ plus community, simply having family members who are LGBTQ plus, simply having friends, professors, lecturers, instructors, teachers, clinicians, etc. Just having the consistent exposure, and since there is advancements in socio-political arenas when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community, more people are identifying as LGBTQ plus, coming out of the proverbial closet, being more open with their gender and sexual diversities, etc. And the more people who come out, etc., or choose to identify, the more exposure that cis heterosexual folks have to these marginalized, gender and sexually marginalized individuals. And that consistent exposure builds rapport and acceptance. Now, acceptance is different from tolerance. Tolerance, you're just tolerating their existence. Okay, you're there, I don't really like you, but I'm not going to cause your death or etc. You're just there, I'm going to ignore you. Whereas acceptance, you're embracing that person. Okay, you're there. Let me have a conversation with you. What's your name? Tell me your goals. You know what? I like your goals. I like what you're about. Let's be friends, right? So that's the difference between tolerance and acceptance. You want to always aim towards acceptance, not only tolerance, okay? So we have some primary LGBTQ plus activists. Now, unfortunately, there are a host of stereotypes that exist. Now, again, what are stereotypes? Stereotypes are these overgeneralized, oversimplified beliefs about a particular individual and or group. Okay, now these beliefs and ideologies are not true. They're just made up scripts. Now, you will have some textbooks that say that stereotypes have a kernel of truth to them, etc. However, most of them, it's just these made up discursive devices in order to further delimit the interpersonal possibilities when it comes to already marginalized people. So one of the many stereotypes that exists against Black people is that Black people as a collective, as a whole, are homophobic, transphobic, anti-LGBTQ, and that couldn't be further from the truth. So let's dispel some of these stereotypes today. So we have 3 Black activists throughout history who advocated for the LGBTQ plus community. Okay, so here, top left, we have Mrs. Marsha P. Johnson. She was a Black trans woman who initiated the Stonewall resistance. Now, there was a bar in New York called the Stonewall Inn, where many members within the LGBTQ plus community gathered to drink their spirits and libations and to socialize and commune. However, during the 70s and beyond and earlier, the police will regularly stand outside of these known queer establishments just to basically terrorize the patrons who went there because sodomy was illegal. Now, sodomy is this anal sex law. Okay, that's what sodomy is used to connote, anal sex. Okay, anal sex, coitus. And coitus is a fancy word for sex. Okay. So when it comes to sodomy, it's often also used as an umbrella term to encapsulate any sexual behavior that is outside of a man being on top of a woman in missionary position. Now you may ask, Dr. Maldonado, why are you so explicit? Because the laws are explicit in this way. So are many religious texts. In order to outlaw something, you have to be very explicit and detailed in what you're trying to outlaw, stigmatize, demonize. So any sexual act that was outside of a man being on top of a woman, missionary position, where there's penile vaginal intercourse, that was considered sodomy. Okay? And you can be creative with your own imagination when it comes to the diversity of sexual acts human beings can engage in, either by themselves or with other people. So, due to these anti-sodomy laws, the police often raided well-known LGBTQ plus hotspots in various areas. And so with the Stonewall Inn, this was a regular occurrence. And so on this particular night during the summer, police came in and started harassing the patrons of the Stonewall Inn. Marsha P. Johnson picked up a shot glass and threw it at one of the police officers and said, "That is enough, get out." So the police get mad and they start fighting the patrons, trying to get to Marsha P. Johnson. And the patrons fight back. They start throwing stuff too to get the police out of the bar. And so it was a whole fight, a group fight, which broke out into the street. And it was a whole fight where other people started to jump in on the police and everything. It was a brawl. And so with that Stonewall resistance, that birthed what you know today as the Pride Parade demonstrations around the world, where people march into the streets with their colorful rainbows, colorful clothing or lack thereof, etc., as a remembrance of the Stonewall resistance. That's where it came from, people. You got to know your history. So a Black trans woman started that. If it wasn't for Marsha P. Johnson, there wouldn't be a Pride Month. There wouldn't be Pride commercialization. There wouldn't be Pride parades. It wouldn't be a celebration all over the world when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community. And as I tell my classes all the time, the further back in history you go, the blacker it gets. Okay? So let's move on. You have Pauli Murray. Now, Pauli Murray was a lawyer and activist in the early 20th century who built the legal frameworks that paved the way for both the civil rights movement and the feminist movement to take place. Specifically, she initiated the legal proceedings in arguing why discrimination based upon sex was illegal. And this led to the 19th Amendment, which made sex discrimination illegal. Now, many of you will probably look up the 19th Amendment or you know it off the top of your head. Well, Dr. Maldonado, the 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. No, it doesn't. Surprise, right? The 19th Amendment says nothing about voting, nothing about suffrage. The 19th Amendment simply says that sex discrimination is illegal. Women technically do not have the right to vote. The 19th Amendment does not say that. And that's going to be a conversation for a different day in a different class. Okay? So you can thank Pauli Murray, who was a trans man. However, a trans man, that language, that discourse did not exist during her lived experience between 1910 and 1985. Okay? Well, later on in the 20th century, but certainly not during 1910. However, trans existences did definitely exist during her tenure on this earth and beforehand. However, the discourse of trans did not exist. So moving on to Bayard Rustin. Now, Bayard was a gay civil rights activist who fought alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the quest for integration and social political freedom for African Americans in the United States. Now, because he was gay, Dr. Martin Luther King and his associates agreed with Bayard and said, you know what? White people have made up stereotypes about Black people being hypersexual, sexually deviant, and gender deviant. And it wouldn't be a good idea if you are at the front lines with us because you are an out and proud gay man, and the sexuality, it would just affirm the stereotypes that white people have about Black sexuality. And it wouldn't be a good idea. So Bayard Rustin, he agreed to take the rear lines of the movement, kind of going into the shadows, because he understood the argument that the rest of the coalition were making to him. Okay? So he still advocated for LGBTQ plus rights, okay? However, unfortunately, that history is elided from most of your textbooks, okay? As with most Black history and most Black accomplishments, as you've probably never heard of these individuals before, and that's due to the white supremacist textbooks and writings and sexist and transphobic and homophobic writings that unfortunately many people are hyper exposed to. However, Bayard Rustin has a movie on Netflix. I'm not sure if it's still on Netflix, but it was released on Netflix. You can check that out if you want some more history. So I'm going to show you parts of a documentary called Paris is Burning, and it examines ballroom culture in New York City. Now, ballroom culture is this transformative arena where marginalized LGBTQ plus Black and Latino individuals, Latina individuals come in and perform these imagined and real identities, okay, that they want to aspire to and or have inspired to in terms of class, in terms of success, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, and etc. Okay? So these are the questions that I want you to think about. What does it mean to vogue? How do the balls provide Black and LGBTQ? What do the balls provide Black and LGBTQ youth of color? How do LGBTQ queer, I'm using queer as a verb here, queer or transform what it means to be and have a family? How are gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and class contextualized within the film? In other words, how is intersectionality demonstrated? Okay, so make sure to watch the video, which I'm going to show shortly, and check it out.